Welcome, everyone. Today we're diving into a really intriguing topic. How can China be socialist if it has a stock market?
Yeah, that's a question that really puzzles a lot of people.
Exactly. It's all about what they call a socialist market economy. You see, China managed to mix a lot of state control with market mechanisms.
Right.
It's like they found a middle ground between pure planning and free market chaos.
Right, sort of like having the best or sometimes the worst of both worlds, isn't it?
Absolutely. It all started with Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up. Back in the 1980s, China began to open its economy to market forces. But hey, it wasn't a free for all. The state maintained super important roles, especially through state owned enterprises.
Yeah, interesting. And that's where the whole idea of socialism with Chinese characteristics comes into play, isn't it?
Exactly. It's like reinterpreting socialism for modern times. They kept socialist ideals, but embraced market tools to ramp up growth, reduce poverty, and, well, modernize the economy.
Exactly. But isn't it a bit contradictory? I mean, typically, a stock market is a hallmark of capitalism. How do they reconcile that with socialist theory?
That's a great point. It's not as contradictory as it might first appear. Think of it this way: the stock market in China is more like a regulated tool. The government uses it to provide liquidity and allow some market behavior, but the crucial levers of the economy, like the largest companies and key sectors, remain state
Yeah, I
controlled.
see that. So, the stock market is more of an accessory rather than the engine driving the economy?
Precisely. They manage what we might call managed competition. It's like they allow competition to flourish on a micro level while the state keeps control over the macro direction.
That makes sense. I also recall the birdcage economy analogy that Chen Yun introduced. It illustrates how the economy has some freedom but is confined within strict boundaries.
Yes, that analogy is spot on. Picture a bird in a cage. The bird has room to flutter, but its flight is confined. In China's case, the market, including the stock market, is allowed to operate within parameters that the state carefully designs and monitors.
Yep, perfectly put. Now, some critics might say that having a stock market is inherently capitalist. What's your take on that criticism?
That's valid from a textbook perspective, but here's where pragmatism really wins out over pure ideology. China realized that to achieve rapid industrialization and transition out of poverty, a little bit of market driven innovation was necessary. They're not dogmatically capitalist about it. Rather, they use the market as a lever, not the end goal.
Right, I follow you. So, in a way, this model is more about creating a system that works practically rather than sticking to ideological purity.
Exactly. Deng Xiaoping famously said, "It doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice." In other words, the focus was on effectiveness. They grasped the big picture with state control while letting the small scale market aspects run their course.
Yep, that saying really captures it. But don't you think this dual system might foster conflicts in policy or even lead to unintended consequences?
I get that, and it's a tension that's always present. Some argue that by mixing these elements, you risk creating policy contradictions. However, the Chinese model has evolved to be, well, resilient. Their approach of managed competition helps mitigate some of those risks by keeping the most strategic sectors firmly under state control.
That's a valid perspective. And what about wealth distribution? In many capitalist models, a stock market can drive wealth inequality. How does China's system address that?
Now, you're hitting on a critical aspect. Wealth inequality is an issue, and while the stock market can exacerbate disparities, the government's recent push for common prosperity aims to rebalance that. It's like they've recognized that unchecked market behavior can lead to extremes, and they're stepping in to ensure broader social welfare
Yeah, very
remains a
interesting.
priority.
But some might say that the push for common prosperity could dampen the dynamism of the market itself. How do you see that playing out in the long term?
That's a keen observation. There is a risk that overregulation could stifle innovation. Yet, the model is built on the idea of balance. The state selectively intervenes to curb excesses without smothering the engine of market creativity. It's a delicate dance.
A dance indeed. And when comparing this to the US or other Western economies, the contrast is pretty stark, isn't it?
Absolutely. The US model is heavily financialized. Stock markets are central, with massive capital flows and investor influence. In contrast, China's model is designed mainly to serve state priorities and maintain social stability over pure market profit.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost like two different philosophies of economic management. One that prioritizes free market dynamics and one that prioritizes state-guided growth.
That's a great way to put it. In China, it's a nuanced blend. They integrate market tools where they make sense, but always with the state as the ultimate architect of economic policy.
Totally. I guess one of the most controversial aspects is whether, by having a stock market, China is, in fact, undermining its socialist credentials.
And that's a debate that really divides opinion. Some critics, from a pure ideological standpoint, argue that any form of market economy is anti socialist. But then, if you look at the results, massive economic growth, improved standards of living, reduced poverty, you can't say it hasn't worked.
Right, it's a real world test. Still, we should also consider the long term implications. Is this managed model sustainable, or will the inherent contradictions eventually create cracks?
I totally get where you're coming from. There's always the question of sustainability. The challenge is maintaining the balance as the market and global dynamics evolve. Some scholars predict that the contradictions could intensify, while others argue that it's just a continuous evolution. It's a live experiment
That's a
in
fair
governance.
assessment. And let's not forget, this model also actively rejects some of the Western prescriptions like the Washington Consensus, right?
Yes, definitely. China has, in many ways, charted its own path, rejecting one-size-fits-all economic advice. They focus on what works for their context. The stock market, for example, is not an end in itself, but a tool, one that's kept secondary to the larger goals of state-directed development and stability.
Yeah, that's quite revolutionary in concept. I find it fascinating how this setup challenges our usual definitions of socialism. It shows that economic systems are not monolithic. They evolve based on local priorities and historical context.
Exactly. It's a vivid reminder that socialism, capitalism, and everything in between are more like points on a spectrum than strict categories. China's blend shows us that economic policies can adapt even under seemingly contradictory circumstances.
In a very dynamic way. You know, while I appreciate the pragmatism, I still wonder if this approach might end up compromising the integrity of each system. Like, could the mix ultimately create confusion rather than a coherent policy?
That's a very respectful challenge. There's definitely a risk of policy muddle if the balance tips too far one way or another. But the evidence so far indicates that China's system, though complex, is highly managed. The state keeps the reins tight enough while still allowing market behavior on the fringes.
Yeah, it's a careful balancing act. It really does seem to be a live evolving case study in how to merge different policy ideologies.
Absolutely. What's exciting is that, whether or not you see it as pure socialism, the Chinese model forces us to rethink definitions. It demonstrates that economic success isn't solely about following a strict ideology, but about adapting to real-world challenges.
Indeed. And with the world watching how their model evolves, we might get lessons that apply beyond China's borders.
Exactly. Other countries, too, have started questioning if a purely free market approach really works, especially given issues like wealth inequality and market volatility. China's model, despite its controversies, offers alternative strategies.
That's an important takeaway. So, to sum it up, the existence of a stock market in a socialist country like China isn't a contradiction, but rather a reflection of a practical, managed approach that prioritizes state control while still leveraging market efficiency.
Precisely. It's like having the best of both worlds, if you can keep them balanced, that is. The state guides the overall direction, steers key industries via state-owned enterprises, and uses the stock market as one tool among many, not the central focus.
Exactly. And while this model might raise eyebrows in ideological debates, it's undeniably been effective in terms of growth, poverty reduction, and, well, national stability.
Absolutely. And it challenges us to expand our understanding of what socialism means in the modern economy. Its evolution is a reminder that policies must adapt to local contexts, and sometimes That means blending ideas that originally seemed
It's
opposed.
fascinating stuff. This conversation really leaves us with much to ponder. Economic systems, after all, are not static. They evolve with time, needs, and global pressures.
Right on point. The Chinese experience shows us that even concepts we think of as fixed can be reimagined. It's an ongoing conversation between tradition and modernity, ideology and pragmatism.
Absolutely, yeah. And that, in many ways, makes this topic extraordinarily dynamic and timely in today's global economic landscape.
Couldn't agree more. Whether you're in favor of this blend or skeptical of its long term sustainability, it's an outstanding example of how economies can innovate beyond traditional labels.
Yeah, very true. Well, this has been a fantastic dive into economic theory and practice. Thanks for exploring these nuances. It really challenges our conventional thinking.
Thanks for the engaging back and forth. It's conversations like this that remind us how layered and interesting our global economy is.
Indeed. Here's to rethinking economics, one managed stock market at a time.
Cheers to that. Until next time, keep questioning and exploring the myriad ways ideas can be both contradictory and effective simultaneously.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks for tuning in, everyone.